the waiting room. We had a lot of interest in today's presentation, so just going to go ahead and give it the requisite Zoom 30 to 45 seconds. Thank you all for showing up today. We're very excited to showcase human factors. All right, go ahead and give it just a couple more seconds before we kick things off.
Sorry.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started just so that we have plenty of time. Hello, everyone. I'm Stacy Heilman. I'm the Vice Chair for Research Operations in Department of Pediatrics, and I am a co-investigator on Core 4 of the ACME-POCT grant. And we are in charge of education and dissemination, and we're so happy to be here today to tell you about positive results and how human factors insights can lead to better diagnostics for reported care test design. Real quick, I just want to acknowledge our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Oliver Brand, who was one of the initiators of the ACME-POCT, and he sadly passed away just about 3 years ago now. We really owe a debt of gratitude to him for everything that he did for the point of care device community, as well as just really setting this whole program up for success. So if you're so inclined and wish to give in his memory, we will really appreciate it. The ACME-POCT, the Atlanta Center for Microsystems Engineered Point of Care Technologies, is an NIH-funded grant that really has at the core of its mission towards creating point of care devices that will be useful for healthcare. We're set up in such a way that we really have a focus on the technology as well as the clinic. And then, as I mentioned in the beginning, the dissemination of best practices so everyone learns from what we see from helping all these different device developers. And today's presentation on human factors really interestingly kind of permeates across all of these different missions within the ACME-POCT. So I'm really excited to share with you today the learnings from this core and kind of how, or this approach and how it really affects all of the technologies that we touch. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers who are going to tell you all about human factors. So Sarah Farmer first is a research scientist at Georgia Tech and the Associate Director for the Development of Center for Advanced Communications Policy and the Director of Home Lab, which is a human factors research initiative. She is the human factors co-lead for the ACME-POCT. Amanda Piegler is a research scientist at Georgia Tech and Director of Testing and Evaluation at the Center for Advanced Communications Policy, and she is a task leader for Home Lab. She is the Human Factors co-lead for ACME-POCT. And last but certainly not least, Rebecca Shiner is a research scientist at Georgia Tech and task leader for Home Lab and the ACME-POCT. Her research specialties include industrial design and public health. And then one thing I'll just say before I turn it over to them is that is that in the end, we're going to leave plenty of time for questions. And we really want to encourage you all to ask your questions in real time. A lot of times we do this as a webinar, but today we chose to do it as an actual Zoom presentation so we can try to emulate more of that interaction. So you can ask it in the group, or at the end, we'll have this special little thing where you can request a Zoom room and join the Home Lab experts and human factors experts in a separate Zoom room if you just want to kind of ask your question one-on-one or in small groups. So there'll be more on that later. But I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues now. Take it away.
Thank you, Stacy. We are happy to be here with all of you today. So I am going to go ahead and jump in. So this is just an overview of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to provide a brief introduction to human factors and tell you just a little bit about the history of human factors because I find it a delightful topic. And then just kind of a brief deep dive into some critical components of human factors. Then I'm going to give a very brief overview of Home Lab, what it is, and who we are. This is something I could probably talk about for an hour, but I'm going to try to condense it to a couple of minutes for today. Then I'll be passing it over to Rebecca, and she's going to cover some of the evaluation methods that we conduct, specifically focusing on what we've done for diagnostic tests over the last 5 or 6 years. And then Amanda's going to cover some best practices for designing diagnostic tests, and then we'll pass that back to Rebecca, who's going to give you some concrete examples and provide some resources. Okay, so a brief history of human factors can almost be summed up in these two pictures. So Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man on the left was created around 1490, and it's one of the earliest sources of guidelines for anthropometry. Anthropometrics still play a very important role in human factors and usability, including accessibility and ergonomics. So in more modern times, jump forward 500 or so years, human factors and usability can really be traced back to around World War II, largely because technology had kind of outpaced the ability of users to compensate for poor design. So when technology was very simple, even just 100, 150 years ago, humans could kind of compensate for poor design. There was only so many controls and inputs, and they could kind of handle it. But then as we developed technology, we really saw that the technology kind of outpaced the ability of the users. So this was largely seen in airplane accidents with very highly trained pilots, including military pilots, and it was due to issues with the instrument control design. So I am going to cover this a little bit, I think, in 2 slides, but you can see in this picture that the center image at the bottom shows what the landing control and the flap control looked like in a B-52, and you can see that they're pretty much identical. And then on the left and the right, you see that they were redesigned to prevent errors, and so that the landing control was wheel-shaped and the flap control was flap-shaped. So just to sum up what human factors is briefly, it involves designing objects and systems to fit the capabilities and the limitations of people who will use them in the environment in which they're intended to be used. Okay, so here's kind of what we do in a nutshell. So first, we try to understand what the system or what the technology or what the diagnostic test requires a user to do. So what physical, sensory, and cognitive tasks are required from a user. We document these task demands. Then we want to understand a user's abilities. So users come in all different shapes and sizes. We have experts, novices, young users, older users, individuals with disabilities, etc. We want to try to understand how the cognitive, physical, and sensory abilities are going to vary for each of these users. Then we want to consider how user abilities and task demands change based on the situation and the environment. So this is the silly example that I always give. But let's say we had the world's finest ergonomic designers and they created a shampoo bottle that is so easy to grasp and hold and open, and it's easy for people with arthritis to use and people with physical disabilities. It's great. And so they tested it in a lab, they brought people in, they had them grip it and open it, and everything went well. But then the thing is, a shampoo bottle is not really intended to be used in the lab. It's intended to be used in the shower where everything is very wet, and that can impact a user's ability to grip and open the shampoo bottle. So it just kind of highlights the importance of the context and environment. So in terms of, a diagnostic test or a COVID-19 test, a test may have a certain temperature and humidity limitations, which is great to use in a lab. But if you remember back in 2020, 2021, we had a lot of drive-through testing sites for people to come and get tested. And so one thing we found here in Georgia was that in Georgia in the summer, when it's 90 degrees and 95% humidity, those original temperature and humidity limitations that were okay in the lab may not be okay outside. So that's kind of considering the environment and the context of use. And then to look at the image on the right, which Amanda designed for us, if a user ability exceeds the task demands, we are good to go. And if not, it's an opportunity for design improvement. I'm going to very quickly try to cover different types of user error. So there's several different types of human error, which is also known as user error. So for a highly trained or expert user, we can expect to see skill-based errors. Skill-based errors include a slip of action or a memory lapse. So in point of care terms, a slip of action would be something like an experienced nurse who collects an incorrect sample. So maybe she collects a mid-turbinate instead of an NP swab. A lapse would be a tired nurse who forgets to shake the sample before adding it to the test device. We also have mistakes. These are also called thinking errors. These are more likely to occur with our novice users, so for instance, home users who are not as experienced with diagnostic tests. A rule-based error might occur when the user applies the know-how of another situation to a novel situation. So for example, early on in the COVID pandemic, when users went to have samples collected in clinics and hospitals, it was often those NP swabs. So if they took that knowledge of how deep that swab should go and then went home and they're, intended to collect an anterior nares swab, but they stick it much deeper, that would be an example. And then last, we have our knowledge-based errors. So this would be when a user has insufficient training or resources. So for example, the instructions for a diagnostic test might instruct a user to collect a nasal sample, but without providing, specific information for someone who does not have that clinical background. If the user doesn't know how to do this, we'd have insufficient training and resources. So then we have our design-induced errors, and that's what a lot of this talk today will be about. So design-induced errors are also called latent human error, and these are errors that can be contributed to the poor design of a technology or a system. So in other words, it's just an error waiting to happen because of the design of the product. Design-induced errors should be largely avoidable with a little bit of human factors consideration, and so that's what we're going to try to communicate to you all today. So these images show one of the first human factors driven changes to airplane controls. Pilots would frequently activate the wrong controls upon landing, like I touched on in an earlier slide. And to avoid this, critical controls were given different shapes and feels. So you can see here that we've got, the rounder control and the rectangular control so that a pilot can easily feel the difference without having to visually confirm that they have the right control. In diagnostic terms, an example would be if a user needs to determine a positive or negative result based on if the indicator is red or yellow, so a colorimetric result. But if they're trying to decide between red and yellow and the actual color they see is orange, that's going to be a design-induced error. So now I have just a couple of slides to talk about Home Lab. So Home Lab can refer to a couple of things here. So Home Lab is first and foremost our database of research participants representing the diversity of the state of Georgia, and I will talk about them just a little bit on the next slide. But Home Lab is also the team of researchers. So Rebecca, Amanda, and I make up Home Lab among many other researchers. And these researchers come from a variety of backgrounds, and we address challenges at the intersection of technology, design, and policy. So just as an example of some of the expertises we have on our team, we have several people coming from the fields of psychology, including cognitive and engineering psychology. We also have engineers on our team, electrical and mechanical. We've got several people, including Amanda and Rebecca, who come from industrial design backgrounds. We've got several people with public health and public policy backgrounds. And I think we're truly having that variety of expertise on our team helps us come at these problems from different angles and bring our different set of expertises. But Home Lab is also our own set of methods and tools used to collect our objective data pertaining to usability and accessibility. So in the image on the right, you can see our human factors lab. We've got Jordan in the foreground. She's the one on the laptop, and she's actually looking through a two-way mirror so that she can observe a user study in the main lab. And this is so that she can observe and take notes without feeling as intrusive to the user that's in there being interviewed by me, actually. It's also, the set of tools that we have in this lab. So we've got various things that I think Rebecca will dive into a little bit more, but including force gauges, torque gauges, so we can actually measure objectively this data about a diagnostic test and use that to determine whether it's usable or accessible. Let's see. And then I think this is my last slide. So just going over those Home Lab participants that I talked about. So Home Lab was created in 2012, and it is a home health testbed of older adults who have agreed to participate in research studies in their home. So like with my example with the shampoo bottle, it's great to bring users into a lab. There's definitely a time and a place to do that and bring them in and maybe even mock up the lab so it looks like a hospital environment or it looks like a home environment. We can capture a lot of great data that way, but especially for technologies or systems that are intended to be used used in the home, especially over, over a period of time. There's nothing like actually having users use those devices in the home. So a typical study for us might look like us going into the home, handing over a technology, having the user, unpackage it, set it up, and start to use it, and then have them use it for, 2 weeks or 6 months and monitor their use over time and look at whether they're actually adopting these technologies, whether they stop using them, what sort of troubleshooting they run into, what other issues are kind of impacting the acceptance and use of this technology. So to talk about our participants a little bit, it originally consisted of about 550 older adults in the metro Atlanta area. And you can see in the map on the right, it shows we have the most participants in Fulton and DeKalb counties, but we also have them in metro Atlanta into the suburbs, but not quite into rural areas yet. Our demographics represent the diversity of the state of Georgia, and we have a variety of medical conditions represented. We've oversampled for certain conditions such as COPD, diabetes, arthritis, and others, and kind of conditions that we identified as ones that could really benefit from technological interventions. And the idea is that we have home lab to support research in a realistic testing environment and with a very simplified recruitment process. So for example, if we needed a user study and it was going to be for a medication adherence device, and so we determined that we need, all older adults over the age of 75 who live alone, who take at least 3 medications and manage their medications on their own, we can go into our database and quickly find participants that fit this category, and recruit them without having to do cold calls and the more complex recruitment strategies. And then the last thing I'll note is that we also have a home lab kids. So this includes our child participants with a focus on chronic childhood medical conditions. And more recently, we've worked on, we're in the midst of a recruitment and induction update so that we can recruit additional numbers. We're going to focus on having more rural participants, and also adult participants of all ages, because while older adults are always a focus that we love, we have a lot of studies that do require adults aged 18 to 50. And so we're formally inducting those participants into our database. And I will pass it on to Rebecca now.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what Human Factors is and who we are as a center, but I'll talk a little bit about what we do actually. Um, so what goes into our evaluations? We provide support in 3 distinct areas. That's expert review, testing with users, and design support. So our team evaluates everything from wireframes and really low fidelity prototypes up to products that are already on the market. And we test for usability and accessibility at different touch points, from the acquisition of the product and unboxing, to navigating to and through the instructions, successfully completing the protocol and disposing of used components. So the first being expert review. Expert reviews typically involve several evaluators on our team running through test protocols. Like Sarah mentioned, our team is very diverse, and so having multiple evaluators, we see so many different things. Everybody looks for something a little bit different. Um, We also perform heuristic evaluations, which basically compare the product to human factors heuristics. Task analyses help us break down all of the sub-steps that go through the tasks involved in completing a test protocol. Um, and that can help us identify errors and pain points. And also we look at where errors are commonly seen through protocols. So that way we can provide recommendations to mitigate those errors. We also use a lot of tools to assist our evaluations. Sarah showed our lab, and our lab is chock full of tools. So on the left, we've got a test stand, and that's really useful for running multiple trials of a test. And so it performs a wide range of tension and compression testing, and we use it to measure the flexibility of swabs in test kits. And then on the right, we've got a torque gauge, and that is used to measure the rotational force required when interacting with certain components. So, like twisting the tops off of bottles or anything like that. And then next slide, please. And then uh, the really fun part is getting to talk to actual users, especially in the intended use environments. So when budget and time allows, getting feedback from these users is crucial. And we can do that in a few ways. So we can do user testing with pilot user studies or clinical use case testing. We can do observational research, we can do focus groups, and surveys. So um, obviously, researching in the intended use case is not always feasible. So we do have our lab set up to conduct studies. What's great about observational research is that this allows us to gain insights about the products without interfering or influencing users. And that's also very useful for identifying errors or pain points. Um, Focus groups are really great to understand users' attitudes, beliefs, opinions about a product, which can also guide design. And then for surveys, we use validated instruments as well as custom survey design. The most common validated survey we use is the System Usability Scale, or the SUS, which measures the perceived usability of a system. And that just sort of is a quantifiable measure, which is cool. And then for custom surveys, we can get feedback about um, anything from, we did a whole survey about the accessibility of at-home COVID tests. And we can also use surveys for like weeks long home use studies to check in with our users and gather feedback sort of on a weekly basis. And then for design support, we do requirements definition, which would basically build off of a task analysis or observational research to provide some criteria for the design of the product itself. Um, Ethnographic research involves observing users in their natural environments, and that can help really understand users and guide design. The design failure mode and effects analysis, or DFMEA, is a methodical approach that also builds on a task analysis, and it identifies all of the ways that a system can fail and all of the risks involved with that. And then we can also support consumer needs analysis, instructional design, so your QRIs, your IFUs, anything like that, and prototyping. And then when should you seek human factors support? I think this is the biggest question. And our answer is early and often. So how does our evaluation style change for devices in early or late stages? Well, in the earlier stages, we have a lot more ability to influence the actual design of the product. So um, in a later stage, when the product is in design lock, we provide more feedback on things that can actually be changed at that point. So in the earlier stages, we were orienting our feedback to streamlining the protocol so that is like reducing the number of components involved in a test, minimizing fluid transfer, considering different component options like swabs or tubes. And so we'll use methods like the DFMEA or user studies. And then in a later stage, our feedback is more focused on resolving sources of error and smaller details. So that's like instructions or labeling changes, anything that's really easy that can help mitigate error. And those methods include user testing and expert evaluation.
Now, I'm going to go over some things we've learned during all of these evaluations that Rebecca just mentioned. We've seen tests like the last slide said, from early stage all the way till design lock. And so we've gathered a lot of best practices over the years for these diagnostic tests. For this presentation, we're going to focus specifically on point of care and over-the-counter tests. I'm going to go over common barriers to usability that we identify, as well as practices that we suggest for test design. So the protocol, a protocol for a test is the order of tasks required to correctly perform the test. The end goal is to get a result, and so we want the user to be able to get all the way to that result and have it be a correct result. And some of the barriers we see within that process is transferring samples or solutions from one component to another. So if there's a lot of mixing of liquids and moving of samples, every time that movement happens, introduces more error or possibility of error. Um, Measuring multiple measuring steps. So if a user has to use a pipette or measure drops or fill to a certain level, that also introduces error. Multitasking. The most common one we see for multitasking is if you're trying to get a swab and the instructions say to rotate 10 times for 30 seconds. Counting to 10 in 30 seconds at the same time is pretty difficult for most people. It helps or it increases the cognitive load for the user. So we flag multitasking pretty heavily on our reports and timing steps. So if there are multiple timing steps, the users are required to use a timer. A lot of times they just won't use the timer, especially if it's something like 30 seconds or a short amount of time. So some best practices that we suggest are each step requires one actionable task. I joke with Sarah and Rebecca all the time. This is going to be on my gravestone. Um, making the instructions and protocol to where you only focus one thing at a time is one of the surefire ways of making sure users do not miss steps or mess up trying to do two things at one time. Timing steps are limited as much as possible using pre-measured solutions. So rather than counting drops, being able to pour the entire amount of a solution into another component. Just fewer components in general. So a good example is rather than having a separate dropper cap, tethering that to the buffer tube. So you're not looking less likely to lose it or drop it, or the more components you have, the more interactions users will have to have with those components, the more likelihood of error using those components. Provide holders or stands to prevent any spilling of solutions. And overall, just minimizing steps for sample collection all the way through sample processing is going to help with the protocol process. So instructions. Most of the time, over half of our feedback for evaluations revolves around the instruction materials. Not only do instructions help users avoid errors, but instructions are a lot easier to change compared to redesigning physical components of a test. So they're kind of the low-hanging fruit for the designers. Consistency between all instruction materials is important. You don't want to confuse the users by conflicting terms or directions between instructions materials, and providing video, such as with a QR code, along with written instructions, increases the accessibility and helps users more fully understand the protocol. Everybody learns things in different ways. So having additional instructional formats, as long as they're consistent, is very helpful. We most commonly see quick reference instructions. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus a little more on the written instructions. And here are some of the instruction formats we see. We see instructions for use or IFUs. Those are more comprehensive instructions that also usually include things like troubleshooting and that fine print. We also see the QRIs, like I mentioned, the video guidelines, and the interface instructions, which are, I think we'll get back on the right slide. Yeah, there we go. The interface instructions, if you have a reader or some kind of app or something, and it walks through the users, it walks them through the protocol. And then we also have your on-device labeling and packaging as well. We're almost there. There we go. Oh, one back. There we go. Perfect. All right. So for the QRI instructions, some of the common barriers we see is small font, too few images. Um, so being able to,
Tracy, I think you may be inadvertently advancing slides.
okay. All right, there we go. Um, so we sometimes we see too few images. Images are, like I said before about the video instructions, images help better communicate what's going on with the instructions. Unclear images, so if it's blurry or just you can't really see the details on it. Multiple actionable tasks lumped into one step, like I mentioned before with the protocol. Inconsistency in terminology, listing warnings only at the beginning of the instructions. So either users may just skip over the warning section entirely, or they'll forget those warnings by the time they reach the relevant step that those warnings are in. And then just having large chunks of text or paragraphs of text that information can get lost if a user's just kind of skimming the instructions. So we recommend one actionable task per step, as well as, let me pull up my notes just in case we get some jumping. Minimum of 10-point font, but if you want to increase accessibility, we recommend 14-point font. Images paired with every step will really help users not only uh, understand the task better, but also helps them keep from skipping instructions as well. Images are large enough for users to discern details, and any labels are large enough to read. Again, that minimum of 10-point font. All color choices are high contrast. So you want to be able to, we use the WCAG guidelines to determine if the contrast is good enough. At the end of the presentation, we're going to link to some resources, and one of those is a contrast checker. And to visually distinguish warnings and notes and place them in relevant spots in the protocol. Some other things that aren't on this slide that we often mention or like to give advice on is if think about the way the QRI is folded in the packaging. So if you want to minimize any fold lines on text instructions, consider users with limited space as well in regards to folding. So can they keep the QRI partially folded and follow the instructions if they're working at this little table? Include a kit's component section so that users know what should be in their kit and what should not be in their kit so that they will be fully prepared before beginning the protocol. And including hands in the images is also very, very helpful for especially motions that are a little more novel and not not typical for a test they may be used to. Hands really help communicate that. All right. So the physical considerations, this is in regards to the physical components of the test kit. So, so some things we usually see are difficult to open packaging. That could be the force. That could be something that requires a lot of dexterity, like a little sticker, sealing sticker you have to peel off, or a foil seal that doesn't really have a big tab, so it takes some extra dexterity to get that off. Small fonts, either on the labeling of the actual cassette or component of the test, or on the packaging as well. Low contrast on that labeling or packaging imagery or text. Uh, Small components that aren't easily manipulatable, if that's a word. And if the or if the device has any kind of beeps or sounds, you want to make sure that they're not too soft as well, where users can hear them in a variety of environments, especially if they're meant for clinical use. They could be in a noisy office, and users may run and go do something while the test is running and not hear a beep or an indicator that it's finished. And so you want to keep that in mind as well. So in general, when you're looking at the components of a test, you want to consider users with arthritis, reduced dexterity or strength, low vision, and low hearing. Those considerations will get you really far in designing and making choices for a accessible test for a lot of a variety of users. Use easy to open packaging with notches, perforations, overhanging tabs, those kind of things. Enlarge components to graspable sizes and add grips to caps so that things are easy to maneuver. Components are stable by design, so rather than having just a little tube that you're having to hold on to so that it doesn't spill while you're getting a sample ready, you want to maybe make that base of the tube wider so that you can put it down and not have to worry about it spilling. Um, Using sans serif fonts just in general for instructions. Oh, I think we're on the wrong thing. I was like, that's not a component. Um, sans serif fonts do help with readability on labeling as well. Um, uh, the text is readable with good contrast on both the labeling and packaging, and any kind of beeps or sounds are clearly audible and supported by other non or a clear visual cues as well. It's not listed on here, but also repeatable. So if you have audio instructions, you also want to be able to make sure the users can repeat it as well. All right, so the interface, these are for an actual piece of hardware or for an app if you have a site like an app to go with your test. So these are some things to keep in mind. Common barriers are the difficulty of navigating to the previous page. A lot of times there aren't back buttons on the designs we see. So if it won't mess up the processing or the protocol, you want to be able to provide the ability to go back as often as possible. Small button size, if users can't press it or they think they're pressing it and it just isn't working. Lack of feedback or process indicator. So if someone clicks something and it doesn't seem like anything's happening, that'll increase the likelihood that they'll continue to press and do other things that could potentially mess up the protocol as well. Unintentional button presses or unclear meaning of buttons, and small fonts and low contrast. You see a theme here. Small fonts and low contrast is a common barrier that spans across different components. So for the best practices for that, you want to incorporate process indicators, provide feedback that the user is progressing through the process. So they're not going to press buttons if they see that there's 4 minutes left in processing. Providing a back button, like I said, confirmation pop-ups or buttons to make sure that they actually want to perform the action. So comfort, are you sure? Pop-ups are great. Sans serif fonts, like I mentioned, and considering the dimensions of the screen. So, especially if it's something like an app where a user could use it on a tablet and a smartphone, you want to make sure that it will be big enough on the smallest screen that it's going to be shown on. So, results interpretation. Um, Anytime that results are shown, um, ex especially with a line or a color change, only it will introduce error, and that's a big thing we see. But I'm going to go over some more things we see. Um, so the lack of or misplaced line labels for test indicators. So these are the ones you get at home, the ones that just show the line with the label on the side. If there aren't any labels, that makes it especially difficult. Or if those lines are not quite lined up with that label, that can cause confusion as well. Confusing language in the instruction materials to describe how to read the result. You want to make sure that's very clear. The presence of faint lines can give the user a little bit of either they may not see it as a line at all, or just kind of question if that is a valid or right result. The color or audio as the only result indicator can cause errors as well in interpretation. So some common suggestions are for digital tests, provide a clear, positive, negative, invalid result, or a multiplex test, you want to provide flu A positive. You want to provide as much clear information in full words as possible. Um, Provide images of all possible results in the instruction materials so that users can compare their result with what's in the instructions. And on top of that, we suggest doing the order of invalid, negative, and then positive in the instructions so that users can first see if they have that invalid result, they can go ahead and just start over. The result labeling has high contrast. The absence of faint lines is great. Full virus names or at least standard abbreviations are used. We know sometimes you can't fit the whole word on a test cassette, so standard abbreviations that leave less confusion. And audio and color are only second indicators of result rather than the primary indicator. I think that was my last one. Yeah.
Okay, well, I can run through an example really quickly before, so we can leave plenty of time for Q&A. But this is just an example QRI, and I made it, and I know that it's bad. I made it intentionally bad to show some um, common issues we see. So looking at it at first glance, it looks pretty good, I think. It looks like there's a lot of white space. It looks pretty cohesive and easily understandable. But if you look a little bit closer, you can see that there's some numbering that restarts. There's numbering 1 through 5 under preparation in the lower left corner, and then numbers restart from 1 through 9 under the test procedure in the middle. We can also see that there's a lot of red. I think if red is going to be used for warnings or really important information, overusing it can kind of dull that message. We can see that there's some images, but there's definitely missing imagery. Under step 5, we see that there is an image of one nostril being swabbed, but if both nostrils are instructed to be swabbed, missing that second image might cause users to not swab their second nostril, and that is an error. Um, what else? Um, there's only one invalid result image when there could be a one invalid result that has no lines. There's also not an image of faint lines under the positive result, which, if users aren't looking for faint lines, they may not correctly interpret the test results. I don't know how much time we have. We can jump to the test kit really quick. So what stands out to me here between these two very generic and very similar looking at-home COVID tests is the buffer tube situation. So in the image on the left in the top middle, you can sort of see a cutoff container of buffer solution. And in the lower left, you can see a test tube that is not filled, but the dropper cap is tethered. So what this means is that users are going to have to perform an additional step of moving the buffer solution from the buffer container into that test tube. What's nice is that the cap is tethered, so users aren't going to lose that component. So that's nice. And then in the image on the right, we can see that the buffer tube is pre-filled and there's a little foil seal that users can remove when they're ready to mix the sample. But that cap is not tethered. And so what that means is that, again, users might lose that, and that's a pretty essential component. The other thing worth noting is that on both cassettes, there's labeling. So that tells users where to look for lines, where to put the sample into the actual test cassette. And these images are a little bit blurry, but in the image on the right, there is a label next to this or below the sample well that has a little drop icon ×3, which just refreshes users and lets them know that they need to put 3 drops in, which can be a really helpful reminder, especially if they're going through the process pretty quickly. But we can move on. So we've got a bunch of resources on our website, including our publications, some best practices guides, some posters from Superglue in 2024. And then we've also got links to a color contrast checker so you can check your instructions and see if the contrast passes. And there's also a color blindness simulator, which is really interesting. It's just sort of to get a feel for what people with different types of color blindness actually might see. And with that, we can jump into Q&A.
So if anyone is interested in using home lab services, or if you have very specific questions, I'm gonna go into a breakout room, and feel free to join and ask me specific home lab services related questions, or feel free to stay in this room and go over general questions with Sarah and Rebecca.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. It's just remarkable how much goes on behind the scenes to make everything so usable. Um, and so just to reiterate, right now we have lots of options for our remaining 12 minutes together. And so feel free to raise your hand and ask your question in real time if you think that other people might be interested in it. Or you can just drop it in the chat, and I can read it on your behalf. Or we've got the breakout rooms if you'd like a little bit of a one-on-one or small group consultation. I think that they'd be delighted to talk to you just to hear about, your ideas and where you are in your development journey and that sort of thing. And I think that, while we're waiting, one thing that I hear you get asked a lot is what's the right timing to contact you? Was there anything as such as too early to reach out to the home lab group?
There is definitely no such thing as too early. This is something we tell project teams and companies all the time. I think people tend to wait for later. So I think kind of the most common service they think of as far as human factors is maybe doing the summative or validation testing, just prior to FDA submissions. But we can help early and often, as Rebecca said. So we have worked with plenty of teams who don't have physical components or prototypes yet. They might have mock-ups or CAD drawings or things like that, and we can absolutely help at that stage. We can help, Rebecca went through a lot of the design requirements and development help we can provide, but we can help you design your components in a way that are going to be usable, rather than evaluating them after the fact and finding the issues and communicating that.
Great, thank you. I imagine, and before I get to there's a question chat, but I do want to just ask the counter to that. Is there ever such a thing as too late?
Yes and no. So I think sometimes we do have companies come to us, and they're in design lock. They've got deadlines and timelines, and we find major issues. And finding, human factors and usability issues that late in the game, it's costly and timely to fix them. So I'm not going to say it's too late. We can still help you, but just consider the cost and the time. And Rebecca, are you unmuted? And if you wanted to add to that.
Oh, no, I was going to say the same thing. But on the earlier side, I was also going to add that, like, even if companies send us like slides or just sort of, an idea, like, we can definitely help provide feedback on where that can go.
Okay, great. I'm going to read Jeremy's question and then I'll take it over to Mingu. So Jeremy asked, can folks older than 70 deal well with iPhones and Android phones equally? That's a great question. How comfortable are they following instructions with moving screens? What do you find in that with the older population?
Rev, do you want to take it?
Sure. I'm not sure if we have like a hard and fast rule here. I think it's going to definitely be dependent on the individual. There are definitely things that can be done to make it easier and more accessible for older adults to see moving screens. And that can be like a replay button so that instructions can be repeated, making sure that the text can be resized in the device settings. So if a user has their text enlarged on the native operating system settings, that actually works for the application itself and enlarges the text there. I don't know. Do you have something else to add, Sarah?
Yeah, that was great, Rebecca. I'll just add that, I think Jeremy, you kind of understand, like, because you asked the question that not all older adults are as experienced with smartphones. A lot of them have smartphones and use them for calls only, or maybe calls and messages, and that's about it. And many older adults absolutely do not have smartphones. So you do have to take that into consideration. It kind of depends on, I guess, what your business model or what your device application would be, whether you're only looking for people who already have smartphones. So that's one thing, and kind of the things that Rebecca said would be really helpful. Or if you're trying to get it into the hands of people who, aren't as technologically experienced. I will add that older adults really benefit from very thorough instructions. They benefit from video instructions in case there's, normative age-related cognitive declines. But that training and troubleshooting piece is really, really important for that group of users.
Um, Mingu, Kim, did you raise your hand? Did you have a question you wanted to ask, or was that just a
No, no.
inadvertent?
I did have a question. Well, thank you, Home Lab, for this session. This is super helpful. Um, so we're building a point of care device that's based on a finger prick sample. So as you mentioned, minimizing steps for sample collection to sample processing, that's something that we're very aware of, and we want to minimize that step, and that's why we have plasma separation and buffer dilution embedded into the cartridge. How we shape that is that there's still a degree of freedom to that, but I guess this ties into Stacy's comment of how early, um, or what when how early can you engage Home Lab? And this is a question that I struggle with because um, say we get a feedback from you saying, "Hey, this is kind of difficult," and for us that um, that design change or that usability change triggers a huge design change internally within our cartridge. So it's for us, then we would have to engage you much earlier from an early concept stage. And at that stage, it's kind of hard for us to simulate how that's going to go. And I was just curious if that's also something you can help with, just based on it's not even a CAD drawing, it's just a couple lines just to show you what how we're thinking about it. And can you just go based off of that?
Yeah, so I'm going to just emphasize again, earlier is often better. I mean, it depends on what your goals are, but what you described definitely earlier is better. We can absolutely work with very, very little inputs than we have in the past. As long as there's something you can show us, something you can describe us, we can still give you feedback. Now, it may not be concrete feedback,
Mhm.
given, there's no physical prototypes, the system isn't designed, but we can tell you considerations, tell you things that you should be looking out for. Yeah, and I agree. I think you kind of really understand the issue. Whereas if you have to redesign one component, sometimes that throws off everything. What I'll add to that is to say that there is no perfect diagnostic test kit. Like there's always going to be, these give and takes. So we want to make it as easy as possible across the board, but we do understand that sometimes, you cannot fix everything. You have to prioritize certain things.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yep.
And next up, we have a question from Michael Tannenbaum at Emory. And he wants to know if everybody can work with you or how much you cost. If you have to pay for it, how much does it cost?
Yes, everyone can work with us. If you talk to us and we feel like it's a good fit, we can help you. We're absolutely interested in working with you. As far as cost, if you want to jump into the breakout room with Amanda, she can kind of go into detail because it very much depends on what services are required. So we have kind of three basic evaluation tiers that cover some of the more common evaluations we do, and then we can customize it from there.
And we have another question about income countries and the considerations that are important there. Do you have any experience there that you could share?
So what we do have experience with, not necessarily in countries, but in rural areas or low income communities, lower resource areas, absolutely. We love working in that area. And I think you specifically asked about a DFMEA. So the practice of a DFMEA is not going to differ, right? But the things that we're going to consider are, so we might be looking at a different set of skills and abilities. There may not be as, as many technological skills. We're going to consider the context and environment because it's very different, right? We may not have, we can't assume everyone has Wi-Fi, things like that. We can't even assume that people have electricity. So that is kind of how it shapes, that evaluation that we would conduct.
Yeah, and I'd add that some of that's maybe unexpected, and that leads into the last question here is that as you're designing tests or working with developers, what are some things that are unexpected? I know you can't predict everything, but what are some things that you found that just came up that were surprising?
Rev, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so we ran a user study, and we saw a bunch of people putting, not being able to locate the tube holder, which was on the test kit box, and actually taking the buffer tube and putting it into the sample well on the test cassette. And we saw that multiple times. And it was just so hard because it's like you can't interfere and say, oh, you're making the wrong choice. That's not what that's designed for. And in terms of addressing that, I think clearer instructions, clearer packaging is definitely the way to go for that. And also maybe considering the design of the components, like can the buffer tube actually fit into the sample well? And if it looks like it can fit into the sample well, then people are going to put it in there.
Thank you
Um,
so much. And I'd like to just say, as part of the ACME team, that we are so proud of the Home Lab group and the work they've done to improve health and to help device developers. And that's what I think their big strengths are, helping device developers. So if you're falling in that category, I encourage you to reach out to the Home Lab team that we're speaking today, and they can give you advice on how to better your project. Now, we have a whole series of glue lectures that happen 4 times a year, and we have a super glue where everybody will get together in the spring. we invite everybody as they see those opportunities to engage and come back and be a part of the team. And lastly, Angie Dill put a link to the evaluation for this Glue Talk in the chat. We'd like you to go there and fill that very short survey out. Give us some ideas for where we can go in the future with this. And we again thank you. Appreciate your work. We appreciate your help with these glues. And thank you, Sarah, Rebecca, Amanda, for your great presentation today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.